Hello and welcome to this introduction to the Mongols and their landscape. This is modern Mongolia. You'll see that it's located slightly to the south of Russia, slightly to the north of China and slightly to the east of Kazakhstan. You'll see it's a landlocked country. You'll see it's a continental country. You should note though that the area occupied by the Mongol tribes in the Middle Ages, the period that we're going to be looking at, was a bit larger than this and took in bits of Kazakhstan, bits of Russia and bits of China, the provinces of Inner Mongolia. What we're going to have a look at today is how the landform, geography and climate influences the history of the Mongol Empire. So there's a number of different factors that influence the Mongols' landscape. The first is, as you'll see on this map, that it's a landlocked country. There's no coastline, no access to the sea, to sea route, to sea trade. So it's going to be a very different way of life to what you might see in Japan or medieval Java or the Vikings, for example. This means they're going to have different ways of transporting themselves and their goods and of conquering other nations. Note as well the ranges of mountains in the west and the north, and the Gobi Desert in the south. Also notice the lines of latitude. Mongolia at 47 degrees north has very long winters and very short summers. Canberra is only 35 degrees south, and Hobart's 42 degrees south, if that gives you a bit of a comparison. Also, it's worth observing the altitude. The whole country of Mongolia is on a high plateau, with an average altitude of 1,500 metres above sea level. Mongolia isn't a particularly densely populated country. You will see in the bottom map on this slide that there are concentrations of population around the major cities, but in the desert in the south especially, it's very sparse. In the north, there is a slightly different landscape, which enables a little bit denser population, but it's still nothing like what you'd see in the areas around Australia's eastern coast. Mongolia is also quite an ethnically diverse country, as you can see in the map at the top here. And each of these different groups has grown out of the different tribal affiliations, variations in language and religion, and the different groups who have made Mongolia their home over its lengthy history. Having a look at the topography, you can see these large mountain ranges that cut across the north of Mongolia. And you can see the impact that these have on, the impact that the elevation, changes in elevation has on the temperature. Mongolia is a continental climate, so it's got large daily and seasonal temperature ranges. There's a prevailing wind from the west that's moderate to strong. It's high, it's cold, it's dry. Low rainfall as well, as you can see in these graphs. The country averages something like 257 cloudless days a year, i.e. only 100 and something days with cloud, whereas Canberra has 108 days of rain each year. Conflict over water resources, particularly in the south then, important for raising animals and looking after people's needs, is going to be a major feature of conflict between different Mongolian tribes. Notice that the precipitation is highest in the north, where the mountains are, averaging 20 to 30 centimetres per year, about half of what Canberra is. So even the wetter parts of the country are much drier than the ACT. The lowest rainfall is in the south, about 10 centimetres, which is where the Gobi Desert is. Some areas of this receive basically nothing each year. These different levels of rainfall and different levels of elevation give rise to very different sorts of vegetation. So if you think about the southern third of Mongolia as desert, the middle third of Mongolia as grassland, and the northern third of Mongolia as being mountains, hills, and trees and forests, that's sort of a rough way you can think about it. It's worth noting though that these grasslands and forests are the cause of one of the threats that the landscape presents to the Mongols, that of wildfires. It's also worth noting that the temperature and climate of Mongolia can give rise to these terrible storms called zuds. These are come in different sorts of forms depending on the consequences they have for the Mongols and their herds. So there's those that freeze animals solid to death in the fields. There's those that prevent animals from getting access to water and dehydrating and dying. There's those that prevent animals from getting access to food resources, and so they die. This is some satellite images of the frozen lakes at Kar-Us from the satellite. You can see how these northern lakes get pretty cold. So what we're going to do now is take a trip from the top of the mountains where the snowpack forms and the glaciers are through to the south of Mongolia where the rivers run out into the desert. So you can see a very pretty landscape, a very striking landscape, but pretty cold and treeless and not much vegetation up here in the mountains. But as you move down into the forested valleys, you start to collect some of that meltwater in lakes, and you have trees, which are an important habitat for animals and a source of wood for people. Moving down to the high meadows, lovely wildflowers. This is the Orkhon River near where Genghis Khan was born, and you can see how important these rivers snaking across the landscape were. Moving across to the steppe, that middle third of Mongolia, a great grassland that stretches out across from China through Russia, Central Asia, and eventually onto Europe in Hungary. Something like this in the pink. This steppe area also correlates with the ancient trading routes of the Silk Road because, of course, animals need grass. So moving through this grassland was a good way of transiting east from west or vice versa. As you start moving further south, there's greenery around these rivers, but as you move away from the rivers, it gets very barren very quickly until you eventually reach the Gobi, where there's very little in the way of vegetation at all. So Genghis Khan starts by founding his empire in the region of his home, around the Orkhon River, where the Mongol tribe was, one of many nomadic tribes. And over the course of the next 30 years, is able to reach first into northern China and then into Persia. He sadly dies on campaign, but his sons and successors take up the challenge, continuing their expansion into Korea, further south into China, into the Middle East and the Arab world, and across into Europe, taking up the Rus principalities, going on into Poland and raiding into Hungary, Greece, Bulgaria. The expansion continues under Gaiuk and Monka, who eventually expand into Southeast Asia and undertake more campaigns in the Middle East, coming into conflict with the Abbasids and the Mamluks, until the time of Kublai Khan, at which the empire was at its probably greatest extent, including most of what we know as China, large sections of northern Vietnam, Tibet, stretching from the coast of the Pacific right through to the very borders of Western Europe. It's a great story about how this happens, and I hope you'll join me for it.